in the days and works of significant pioneers, we have the pleasure to speak with Kate White, a young lady who has devoted a lot of heart and mind energy on promoting health for our newborns, the families, the world. So hello, Kate. Thank you for coming.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. This is really an honor and quite fun. And it's got to be fun.
Yes, yes. Right. So as you are going to take us back to the early days of your starting your life on this planet, could you start speaking about the cultural, historical, political background of the space-time around your conception? When was that and where?
I was conceived in 1962, and at that time in our country was a time of great change, a cultural change. It was the time of the 60s. It was right during the Vietnam War. In fact, I remember the end of the war. We watched it on television, and my parents were very young. They were in their 20s, and my mother particularly, she had 3 babies before she was 23. But we were a part of, she was a part of the counterculture, trying to protest for civil rights and for just change in our culture. The young people were very empowered, and we have pictures of us as children with big peace signs in front of the White House. So my mother was was kind of a counter-revolutionary person, and my father was a lawyer and a young lawyer, and I was born when he was taking his final exams. So it was a very important time in our country, full of hope. It was full of, like, Bob Kennedy was one of my mother's idols, and he was assassinated. And so many of the great young people that were leading at that time, John Kennedy, Bob Kennedy, Martin Luther King, they were all assassinated. And so there was this growing desire for change and a feeling of power in the young people. So that was the sort of the background to my conception and birth.
It was in the USA.
Yeah.
Which state?
I was conceived and born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the city of brotherly love. And my ancestors were Quaker people. And so it was, it was nice to be born in a Quaker state that for those of you out there who don't know Quaker faith, it's a quiet faith where we feel that of God within, and we are very, we minister as a group, not as a following anyone. So there was even though my parents weren't particularly religious, I learned later that I have many generations of Quakers behind me, and I became a Quaker, young Quaker, and really very much enjoyed that faith. So I was born in Philadelphia, but we moved soon after that to Virginia, where my father went to law school. And where he taught law school, excuse me.
Yeah, so bringing these together, the religious aspects and the social, political aspects of the time, what were, you would say, the most important values and philosophies that reigned during the time you were conceived and later born and raised?
Well, the values were, in my family, I think particularly from my mother's side, were all about justice, freedom, the right to be able to freely speak your mind and have your own path, that you didn't need to be told and controlled. But I think the feeling of justice was really important in my mother's mind, inside of herself. My father, I didn't know all that well, and he left when I was young, but I knew his mother, and she was also very strong-minded about how things went. But I think the socio-cultural background is political, social, and religious freedom.
Right. Right. Your father left. Would you like to share what exactly you mean by saying left?
Well, he and my mother, I mean, I think it just got quite overwhelming for him when I've made a lot of sense of my history. But I think they had 3 babies in 3 years, and my brother and I are only 6 weeks apart. So you can, no, not 6 weeks. I think we're 10 months apart. Excuse me. She conceived my brother 6 weeks after I was born. So I just think it was a lot. And my brother had a lot of particular challenges when he was born. So I think they were young, very young. That my mom was 23 when my brother was born, and my father was 27, I guess. I mean, just young to have so much so soon, so quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it just kind of their marriage disintegrated. And my mother being strong-minded and wanting freedom, and it was during the time of the sexual revolution, so there was a lot of interest in sexuality. I think that my father charted his own course, and my mother charted her course, and the 3 of us kind of found ourselves lost in that. But my father reappeared in my life about 5 years ago. Yeah.
Really? That is
Yeah.
wonderful.
Oh, it has been the biggest delight to have him back, and in a way that, we made repair. For the first 3 months, it was, I'm sorry about this, I'm sorry about that, and constantly, every time we met, we would go over a piece of the history, we would make repair. And he's remarried. He has his 3rd wife now, and he lives in my city here in Charlottesville, where I live, which is where I grew up. And we've made repair, and I feel just so much delight in knowing him, and we have dinners quite often, and it's really been special.
Great news. And now that you are really discovering this father, what do you see in him as parts of his attributes, his identity, value system?
Well, I'd say my father values connection, and he values, I think he loves to have fun. So he's very jolly. He loves ideas and education, and he delights in supporting me and my children. Everybody's grown now. My children are grown, and I just love talking with him, hearing his perspectives, hearing his ideas. At 84, he's still very spry, and he's a physicist and a lawyer, and loves quantum physics and a lot of the things that I think about and love too. So he's been great to be in my life, and he was quite a champion of my work when I worked at APA, the Association for Pre and Perinatal Psychology, and how that's when he re-met me after 40 years of not being in my life. So yeah, it's been great. It's been great to get to know him again, and to feel I'd have to say he just loves life. So the love of life, and being steady on and kind, which is not the man that I remember. He's changed.
Excellent. So going back to that time, your grandparents, do you remember? Do you have anything you can share about your maternal or paternal grandparents?
Mhm. Yes, well, I loved both of my grandmothers. The grandfathers were a little less accessible, but the grandmothers I remember very well. And on my mother's side, she valued children and travel, and she was a teacher and also a business owner in Central Florida. And she loved storytelling,
Oh,
and she
really?
loved parties. And she loved art, and she was just an amazingly charismatic and beautiful woman. And on my other side is kind of the opposite, just sort of stoic and sort of very, very New England America, which is in Pennsylvania. She was very sort of stiff upper, sort of, move on, get yourself going, do the right thing. And she was raised very much to be a woman in a woman's place in America in the 50s and 40s, but really enjoyed the revolutions that were coming through the young women, even though she couldn't participate so much. But she loved my children, especially my son. And we would go visit her, and she just adored my babies. And so it was really wonderful to know her all the way till she died. She died at the age of 99.
Oh, that's a good long life.
Very long life. Yeah.
Right. How many children have you got, Kate, now that you mentioned your children, all grown ups?
I have two children. I have William, who is 23, and my daughter, Eleanor, who's 18, and she's going to college this year.
Right. So your maternal grandmother was in business, apart from being a teacher. What kind of business was it?
She ran a gift shop, what was called I think it was called the Orange Fountain. But she just was a business owner, and really enjoyed also writing books. She was a children's book writer. She published books about children's stories, and loved when we would come to visit and would gather us up and hug us and tell us beautiful stories of children around the world. And she made up stories spontaneously, and it was really a wild place to go to when we were young, Central Florida. And so it was just an exotic, a wonderful, amazing place to go and feel great love, and be a part of my family line down there.
I would be very interested in reading any of her stories myself. Yeah.
Well, there's a book that she's published called Children from Around the World. I'll see if I can find it for you.
Thank you very much. That would be wonderful. Thank you. And your maternal, paternal grandfathers?
So my grandfather, on my mother's side, was very intense, and really the background in our ancestors were the value of boys. So he had 4 girls by my maternal grandmother, and then left her. So then he took another wife and never had more children, but there was a great value put on being a boy. And even though I think he adored me, I was a girl. And so I think there was a way that there was a lot of intensity around him.
Yeah.
So he had 4 girls by my maternal grandmother, and then left her. So then he took another wife and never had more children, but there was a great value put on being a boy. And even though I think he adored me, I was a girl. And so I think there was a way that there was a lot of intensity around him.
Yeah.
So he was just a strong character, and kind of overbearing for my mother. They butted heads, my mother and my grandfather, as you can imagine. My mother wanting freedom and justice, and he was at times quite overbearing. but also very generous at times. So, but he lived in Central Florida and also the Bahamas, and he was a businessman also, and made a self-made man, as so to speak. And my paternal grandfather was a lawyer, and they ran a law firm of generations of lawyers and Quakers up in Pennsylvania. And my grandfather was, on my father's side, was charming and handsome and knew a lot about, so I guess, high society things that you do there, dancing and what drinks to drink when, and how to behave in a high culture. I mean, that's the society that he was in. I mean, he could also be kind of distant, so it was hard to get to know him as a girl. But I got to know his wife, my grandmother, really well.
Right. Thank you for sharing. And you have two more siblings, right?
Yes, I have an older sister, Elizabeth, and a younger brother who now calls himself Thomas. But when I was growing up, we called him Ray.
And what are the best you can see in them? Perhaps there are thousands of best attributes in them, but just to help us see them in our mind's mind.
Well, my sister is one of my closest, dearest people to me, and she lives in North Carolina, and is just a brilliant, creative person, able to really learn just about anything. But we're very close. I would say she's in the attachment sequencing. I know about myself. She's my person. And my younger brother, I think that he is a CPA and works for the government, and has, taken a long time to learn how to be in himself, I would say. He had a very challenging birth and a very challenging childhood, but has a wife dedicated to him and lives in Maryland. I'm very proud of him. I mean, he had quite a lot of challenges growing up, and has, again, taken on this idea of how to make oneself. He's a self-made person also, really overcome a lot of challenges to have a happy life.
That's brave of him.
Very brave. Yes, I would say he's very courageous and also kind. So.
And so, Kate, can you share any story of your early childhood, or the way you were born, or later few first years of your life?
Well, I like I wrote to you, Olga, like you asked me what makes a pioneer. Like, I think that my breech birth played a huge role in my capacity for this human life. I've done a lot of work understanding myself because that's my job. I'm a pre and perinatal specialist working with babies and working with this early stage of life. And so I do think the breech position very much informed my capacity. And once I've drained the charge out of it, because it's a very painful way to be born, but my interest in understanding breech, I feel like a lot of us have great gifts in multitasking and managing a lot of life, which I have done with ease. And people have often asked me, like, how do you do all that? I'm like, I don't know. I think it's the breech in me, honestly. And a lot of us are charismatic and have a lot of unique and unusual ways of doing things in the world. At least that's my experience of the breech. We tend to be pioneers. We tend to do things uniquely. And so I do think that the breech position informed the person that you see here today. And other than that, in my childhood, I would just say I spent a lot of time outdoors. I was a lover of nature. And in fact, when I moved back here to my hometown, I was gone for a long time. I've traveled around the world and had big life, and moved back here. somebody recognized me from, oh, I remember you. You're that nature girl. And so that was how they knew me, and I just excelled at school, and I did a lot of athletics and music, and but I think my teachers loved me, and I had a wonderful time in school, no matter what school it was. And so I think that's the breadth of a big picture of my childhood.
I keep this. Kate White, the nature girl.
Nature girl, yes. And I would find sick wild animals, and I would bring them home and make them well, especially birds. I was really good at finding sick animals, and would bring them home and nurture them. So, I never wanted to be a veterinarian, but I loved the natural world and had a full life of creativity out there with the squirrels and the birds and the deer, and it was full of wonder and love for me. So that very much influenced my life.
And when did you understand that you are to do what you are doing? When was it?
Well, the story I like to tell there is that I was living in Africa at the time, and I had been working in maternal and child health. I had a career traveling throughout the continent, helping improve services. I was a very young woman, which was kind of a big deal for someone so young to have such a position and to be not African. So I had an international career that I had really charted myself towards with a lot of energy as a young person, and then became a regional officer in West Africa, helping a team of African researchers with improving clinical services for maternal child health. And I was, my husband was with me at the time, and he was working at a educational institution that educated a lot of people about AIDS. And so I watched this documentary about a man named Phili Latai, who was called the Lion of Africa. He was a Ugandan, and he caught AIDS. And he spent the last year of his life traveling around educating people about AIDS. And he said the only thing that really kept him going was someone who could massage him. And back in those days, people were afraid to touch people who had AIDS. And so I watched how he would suffer and to try find someone who would just touch him to make him feel better. And I made a pledge at that moment, like, I'm going to go home to the US and do that. I'm going to become a body worker and help people who had who needed body work. And so I did. I left Africa in 1992, began studying and working as a massage therapist for people who had AIDS and cancer in 1993. And that's how I became a body worker. And I think the courage of that man inspired me. And I think that is another one of the elements that makes a pioneer, Olga, is a lot of undying courage.
Yes. You say it so nicely. Undying bravery, courage.
Yeah. And so I started in body work, and I knew I wanted to work with mothers and babies. And so right as soon as I got my certification, I got advanced training in the working with mothers and babies, started that in 1995, and I've never looked back.
Yeah. So going a little bit back, because that is a very interesting thing. I guess that you got married very young.
Yes.
Roy.
Yeah. I got married. Well, I was 25.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it, but I don't know. I met him when I was 22. His name is Brett, and he was the kindest man I'd ever met. And he and I became very good friends, and then we became lovers, and then we got married. We didn't have children till 10 years later, but we had a pretty big life, traveling and working and doing all the things that young people do. And yeah, I've been very blessed to have such a wonderful man.
The name?
Brett, B-R-E-T, Brett.
Brett. Okay. And we heard about Uganda. What other African countries have you been
Oh,
during those years? Almost every country in Africa, or some of them?
I would say some. I mean, I think there are over 50 countries there. And my specialty was West Africa. So Senegal, the Gambia, the Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. I was in the Peace Corps in Niger. My husband and I were in the Peace Corps there. And so I traveled throughout and, just being a Francophone, so learned French and learned African culture. And it was a place where I first saw how much men could love their babies. I mean, I learned a lot from being in that culture, just about the value of children.
Yeah.
Children were seen as gifts from God. And of course, that wasn't the way I was raised, but it was really a wonderful place for me. And I was very committed to living and working in Africa for over a decade. And so we traveled back and forth quite a bit. I've been to Morocco. I worked in Morocco for a while, and I've been to the East, worked in Kenya and Zimbabwe, Zambia. I think that's all the countries that I've been to besides Zaire, which is now the Congo. I think it's now the Congo. But that's just like a fraction of the countries that are in Africa. It's such a wide continent, so varied, even by country. Oh, I've been to Cameroon too. I think that's one of my very favorite countries in Africa. It was wild, and over 220 ethnic groups lived there, and it was just an amazing, amazing place to work. I've been there too.
So actually, Kate, if you could concentrate all this Africa culture, value, way of living in one sentence, which you can recognize in you, what would that be?
African culture. Well, Africa taught me to really believe in the greater, wider, invisible spaces. I mean, spirit and ancestors and family, and also the value of faith and children. So I really loved the connection. No matter where I went, there was always a place for faith and prayer, which I loved. And no matter where in the country, there was some element of the belief in the invisible space, the invisible world of the spirits. And that's very rich there. And so that was real for me. And I spent a good 10 years of my early life. Like, I came back from there in 1993. So, I mean, I was in my 30s. So I spent over a decade of my life committed to working and living in Africa.
And then you met your mentor. You were endowed with extra information, the nature girl, and you brought it back to you, initially touched by the gift of touch for terminal disease people. And then what was it that brought you to mother-child from cancer and AIDS patients?
Yeah, that's another good story. It's a great teaching story. I often will tell it when I'm in with bigger audiences, and it's definitely going to be a chapter in my book when I write it. But I call the story Client Zero. And so I was a brand new craniosacral therapist at the time. So this was 1999. And for those of you who don't know what craniosacral therapy is, it's a very subtle but powerful therapy where you connect in with all the elements of the body, especially the fluid dynamics, which is connecting into how we are made. And then it connects into how we are born. So I had an intake form at the time that had an inquiry, like, how do you know how you were born?
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a client that was referred to me by a psychotherapist for body work. She had been assaulted and was in shock and in a lot of suffering. And I had her fill out that form. And we did our first session, and then she came back the next time and she said, you know that question you have on your intake form about my birth? She said, I think that my birth is the reason for my lifelong depression, and I want to heal it, and I want to heal it with you. And I thought, oh, okay. I mean, I didn't know anything about this. Our whole field, our passion. I mean, I'm looking at you. I mean, we have this deep passion. But I didn't know anything about that at the time. I just had my first baby, and my first baby, having my baby, connected me to humanity in such a deep way. I could see how special we all are. And so I was like, game, if you want to heal this thing, let's do it. And while I was working on her, I began to have panic attacks. And I had no idea what was happening. So her birth story was that she was a large breech baby in, I guess it was in the 30s. I've tried to find this woman since to tell her what an impact she's had on me. But her story was she was breech and very large. And when she went in to be born, her mother began to hemorrhage. And so they told her father that both mother and baby were going to die. And so he got down on his knees in the hospital, and began to pray. And the story is a nun appeared beside him and began to pray with him. And my client turned herself around during birth, which is an entirely difficult thing to do. And when she turned herself around, she stopped the bleeding. And so she was born head first, and she saved her life, and she saved her mother's life. So when I was holding her, I was just holding her in the craniosacral therapy, just holding for health and holding for healing and all the things we know how to do. She began to process. She would say, my feet are in my way. She was back in the memory of what happened, and she had this near-death experience. And so when I began to have panic attacks, I was so confused. I'm like, what is this? So I called up William Emerson, who was the only person I knew at the time. I just heard a lecture of his, of course, which ignited my passion in the biggest way. Gosh, William Emerson. I mean, I consumed everything he wrote and all of his lectures in a matter of days. And I called him up and I said, this is happening. And he said, well, why is that happening there? I'm like, I have no idea. I thought you could tell me. And he led me through examining my birth, which is also breech and a near-death experience. And so that her near-death experience and breech birth and triggered my memory. And I was like, what is that? How could that happen? And that ignited my curiosity and my passion. And then here I am, like 24 years later. So I've turned over every stone and studied with just about everyone and consumed so much information and experience that now I teach. And so, yeah, that's just
So now that you mentioned William Emerson, apart from client zero, who was a very important, a significant human in your life
yeah.
and process, what can you share about William Emerson being one of the pioneers in the field? How have you experienced William?
Well, William, you know, he's an incredibly unique human being. But he got up and told his story at a craniosacral conference. And he told the story of losing his twin sister at birth, and how, and then he tells humorous stories of how he healed that and began to try to develop relationships with women without that early imprint. And but when he told the story of his twin loss, I felt like something opened in me and set me free. And I was ignited in a way that I just swooned. I fell in love with the work. And then William was the one that began. He said, I think you should get trained. When he heard my story, if people are remembering their births in your presence, you need to be trained. And so I went from being a student of Williams to being a student of Carlton Terry, who was his student at the time. And then from there, I went on into studying with all the master teachers. But William has been consistently friendly with me, and just himself, never wavered ever from just being his unique self. And I would say he is the grandfather of all of us, those of us who've learned, talk about courage and bravery. I mean, he ran and the whole theme of it in the primaling days. We've changed a lot since then in terms of our approach, but his early time, along with the stories of his life in India and the work he did with Frank Lake, and I mean, he was one of those amazing people that really changed the understanding of the baby's experience.
And then you mentioned Carlton Terry. Mm-hmm. So he has been one of the teachers. So what can you share about this human being as well?
Well, Carlton, he was also a pioneer, and he had a very unique approach to developing ways for people to understand the earliest of experiences. What do I want to say about Carlton Terry? I don't know. I think he had a level of kindness, but he had a lot of really big tools. Let me put it that way. His tools were cathartic and were, at the time, were very painful for me. And I learned a lot when I was with him. And when I studied, there was a big focus on the birth process. So he had a foundation training where we started with the birth process, and then we went back to the prenatal time. And that, when I got into the prenatal time, was when I really fell in love with the work. But these were early days, Olga. I mean, this was over 20 years ago. And I think the big tools that he had were too harsh for my system. But Carlton was gifted, and was one of my first trainings that I took.
Can you speak about other inspirators or people that have supported you or worked with you in the direction of what you are now offering to the world?
Well, I'm sure you have had others talk about Ray Castellino. I mean, he was a huge inspiration, and he was also a student of Williams. And his relationships with William and Franklin Sills in the craniosacral therapy really brought about a lot of wisdom and understanding the baby's experience. And I credit Ray Castellino with softening some of those big painful tools into something more subtle. And it was his relationship with Anna Chitty, however, I think that really brought about some of those big changes. And so I am a lifelong friend of Ray Castellino. He and I were working together when he got sick and died, and I have a great deal of love and respect and appreciation for Ray and now his legacy teachers. But it was I would have to say, two of the biggest influences on me are not in the pre and perinatal space. They're in polarity and in craniosacral therapy and the autonomic nervous system. That'd be John Chitty and Anna Chitty. And they run the Colorado School of Energy Studies. And John was my direct mentor for 7 years. And we met because of our mutual love of babies. And he was very direct with me. At this point, he had been diagnosed with cancer, stage 4, and he pulled no punches and he got right down to it. He picked me up and said, okay, I'm choosing you and I'm going to mentor you. And he was relentless as a mentor and helping me understand all the principles that went into incarnation and understanding the impact of trauma and how to work with that in the way that he knew how, which was more polarity and energy and the autonomic nervous system. So he was a trauma therapist, but an energy therapist. And then his wife, who's continued his work after he passed away 3 years ago, is now a direct mentor for me, master teacher, and really now couples our greatest spiritual essences right next to understanding our deepest wounds, which of course is a great definition of pre and perinatal psychology.
They were, or he was, direct and harsh on you, but you were also willing to accept
Yes.
the task, which is very interesting, right?
Well, yeah, he was not harsh, he was relentless.
Yeah.
But he was kind, and he taught me a lot about kindness, but firm. And he taught me about equanimity and sovereignty and the balance between yin and yang, and how what he felt like our world needed was a benevolent yang and a strong yin. So a kind leader, strong leader with a partner in understanding the strong feminine. So he taught me a lot about incarnation and how these elements come into our bodies and into our psyches and need to be in our world. And right now, I would say we're not in a time of the strong feminine. And he was all about balance. And so he taught me a lot of skills and understanding the body and the body's responses to stress and threat, but also kindness and presence. And his wife also, the two of them, they really, I feel like, have been formative for me in my life and who I have become as a teacher and as a practitioner. I feel very grateful for John Chitty. And he spent a lot of time with me, and that is how he taught me. It was his attention and his time, which of course were very valuable to him in having stage 4 cancer. And he made sure I knew that.
Yeah. No time to be lost, not the moment.
And no time to play around with, if he felt like I needed to hear something, he told me. But he was also, he also knew how to be kind and to hold a space for me to deepen. But he never gave up. At first, when I resisted, he would just be kind and say, I'm just trying to change the state, Kate. Just believe in me. Believe in this, what I'm holding out for you here. Try it. And I did. And it has made all the difference.
Yeah. I usually say that big teachers are big because they have supported huge students who hold the space.
Well, yeah, he told me later that he recognized me. This is toward the end of his life. He said, I recognized you by the questions that you asked.
Yeah.
So you want to, again, go back to your research question, which I love, but what makes a pre and perinatal pioneer? It was the questions that I was asking as a student in his class that he got his attention. And he said, I see you and I know the quality that's in there. And he would constantly have me orient to who I was becoming and told me it was a responsibility. So, yeah.
So Kate, after all of these steps that you have taken very willingly, where are you now?
Well, now I find myself, I mean, quite by accident, the head of an online school, which is thriving. That happened around COVID. And my particular mission is outreach to mainstream professionals that are working with trauma and birth. And so I have a wide variety of classes and courses in my online school, as well as some dear friends who I just have included in there. But that is, the online school is called Prenatal and Perinatal Healing Online. And it just blossomed during COVID because of the Zoom. And then it became international because that was one of the gifts of COVID. But I also have my own training program. And this program is combining the baby's experience with trauma prevention and treatment along with midwifery. And I co-teach that with a midwife. And that training it's not a long training. It's not arduous as the way it was for me to learn pre and perinatal work, which those trainings are long and they're demanding and expensive. So the training I've developed is shorter, and it's for people who want to prevent and treat trauma right away, who work with birthing families. And it's a way to, my addition to helping to try and change the world through supporting a different culture around birth, especially in our country. I don't know about Greece, but we have some pretty horrible outcomes here, especially for being a wealthy country. Mm-hmm. So I'm creating a new professional, one that can both prevent and treat trauma with families before they go into hospitals to have birth, which is where most of our families have birth in our country. But our training has really good outcomes. Families get better almost right away with our focus and our support. And so right now I'm in my second cohort of training. I have 2 cohorts. I have about 20 students, and it's very small. And so what I'm quite interested in is finding ways I can take the skills that I've learned and scale them up so that this can be out in the world in a bigger way, which is why I love what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like if I could just wed myself to what it is that you are doing, then perhaps we have a hope for our human development.
Yeah. Yeah, let's hope that we will continue and find all the support so that primordial health advancement programs are all of them and be in the service of our new families, new babies, etc. But Kate, back to your work, if you were asked to choose 3, 4 most important learnings you would like to share with health professionals who would like to be involved in this, what you have learned all over these years of patient and persistent work, what are these learnings will be? What will they be? What have you learned?
Well, okay. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that babies are conscious and sentient beings, starting, in utero, preconception even. And so really supporting our families who are wanting to conceive and are birthing, they're pregnant and birthing in a way that takes that in. And how can we really help with human development if we really support the baby on the inside and the family around the baby, starting preconception. I would say for practitioners to do their own work, to have the quality of presence and wisdom and knowing to affirm the challenges. And so a lot of us are drawn to this work because of our own history. And particularly those of us who have challenges like mine with near death and huge pain I mean, we have to metabolize that and become, transformed and be able to sit solid with equanimity with our people, with curiosity, and our people who come to us can feel it. It makes all the difference. So I would say for practitioners to do their own work and to do it with integrity and to do it ethically. So those are two things. And then the third thing I would want for our world, if I could say, out of all the things I've learned, is that the first 2 years after a person is born are formative. And if we could support our families better, whether it's paid family leave or supporting mothers or supporting families with layers of support, so that mothers can feel better, families can feel better around the babies, and then really reflect to the babies their own wisdom and their own knowing, and all with a lot of kindness and wisdom. And it just feels like we don't do enough for our families, at least not in our country. I feel like we need a whole lot more understanding of supporting families with babies in the first 2 years of life. That is also, no matter what happens at births or before births, the data I've read is that can also change the trajectory of that human life, so that there's greater health and greater connection and greater love lifelong.
And if there were politicians around listening to you really seriously, what would you send as a message?
Well, just what I've just said, that how can we support families? And I do think that there are some movements afoot in our country trying to tackle some of the big things with poverty and housing and food in our country. But to really give families the breaks that they need for the first 2 years of life, like many other countries around the world, paid family leave, 1 year at least. Give these family benefits and access to resources, even money, so that they can be at home and feel comfort and support. That will make all the difference for the developing nervous system of that baby. And I feel like in our country, the White House does have a maternal mental health efforts, not yet to understand the baby's experience, but at least to understand the delicate nature of parenting babies and small children, and the importance of really seeing that if we can support families here, it reaps great dividends in the adult life. And one of the things that the fetal brain researchers have taught me is that there are a lot of challenges that can happen prenatally and during birth. Like one thing I recently learned is that birth impacts every gene in our body. That if we brought more consciousness to this, it would impact the health of adults. Many of these challenges don't express themselves until we're young adults. And so the increase of mental illness, heavy mental illness is what they called it, schizophrenia and other types of mental illness, and then the impact on our life. Like, I feel like if we could meet these birthing families in a way with a lot more grace and consciousness and resources and funding, we would have a different world.
Great. Kate, if you look back, although you are very young and you are still progressing and developing and adding to what you have been doing, but if you had the opportunity to look at your life again, is there anything you would do different, or you wouldn't do at all, or anything that you would have done because you have not seen it as important and you didn't do?
Wow, that's a pretty big question, Olga.
Yes.
Actually, I'm not so young. I'm 60 this year. And if I could say one thing that I wished I'd changed is I wished that somebody had intervened in my life and taught me about trauma at a young age, especially as a young adult. I wish that I wish I'd had a lot more support as I made that transition into adulthood. And I really wish, that's why now I would like very much to create programs for young people. And I get asked a question similar to this, a lot, like what would you recommend that we do now?
Mm.
I'm like, well, I think courses on trauma and the impact of stress and trauma on our developing nervous system, and trauma resolution skills, what you can do about it for young people, just so they can recognize if they're in a stress or threat response. And then moving even younger with people in middle school to talk more about sexuality and childbearing. And I think that I just wish in my life I'd had more intervention to help me understand all the things that I was feeling in my body. Mostly it was high levels of activation and what I could do about it. And even though I had some inklings about it, like going out in nature or becoming an athlete, it still wasn't enough. And I wasted time, precious time, spinning around thinking that something was wrong with me or that I was bad. So I wish that there'd been somebody who had said, you're in a trauma loop and we know what to do about that.
Yeah. And what is there for you for the future years, which you would love to complete and offer?
Well, the future me. Well, I'd love to be a part of a team, Olga. I'm much better as a team member than a pioneer or a leader. At least that's my vision of myself. And if I could be a part of a team to help scale up all the things that I've done, that I'm passionate about, the baby's experience, improving the culture of birth, supporting families, and then really translating all that into doable, learnable skills for our professionals, including birth workers and psychologists and medical providers of all kinds that help during this time. So if I could wave a wand and have a wish to be a part of a team that would scale up these things and bring them to fruition with evidence-based practices and power and grace to really change the culture of supporting developing human beings, because we're not doing all that great a job, and it can be done, but we, like you've told me before and we've talked about it, we have to work together.
Yes, that's the time. And let's hope that more and more people see the necessity and the joy for getting together and doing it in a more fun way.
More fun.
And in a more excellent way.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I like it, that it would be fun. I have a saying, it's got to be fun or I don't want to do it. But all this is fun. Everything is fun. Everything I do is fun. Teaching is fun. Global outreach is fun. Connecting with others is fun. Being part of something bigger than myself is fun. It brings me joy, and joy is one of our essential natures that if we have a lack of, you can feel it. But every day I'm filled with joy because I get to do this work, and I work tirelessly and courageously, and it's fun.
Great. So, nature girl, full of joy, wishing and willing to be part of a team promoting good causes. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Olga.